Hello, welcome back to Math Time with Professor Prime, and I'm your host as always, Professor Prime. Today we're going to talk about beat 'em ups, hack and slashes, and action RPGs. And I look forward to that because, like, I enjoy these genres. I enjoy the evolution and links between them. I enjoy the evolution in gaming in general. And so, here's how today's video is going to go. I'm going to talk about those genres. I'm going to talk about the math along the way. I'm going to talk about different games and aspects of those genres and my entry point into all that, right, is like talking about action in general and like the basic premise before expanding into like beat 'em ups and then hack and slashes and then like action RPGs, and kind of like not giving you a comprehensive history of all that, but giving you an idea of where things have been and where they've been hitting. And I look forward to that and just talking about my experiences with those genres because like I enjoy a little bit of everything with my gaming, but I do like me some action games. I do like me a good beat 'em up. I do like me a good hack and slash. I'm a huge Devil May Cry fan, like if you didn't know, and also big on action RPGs with that sort of hack and slash focus, i.e. near Automata, which is my favorite game of all time, if you didn't know. And so I want to talk about all these things and more. From a spoiler standpoint, you should be good because I don't really plan to get into the narrative elements. But, you know, if you want to be extra safe, I get it. Without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so when it comes to action games, and I mean, you could say other games too, but like with action games in particular, the idea, like the general basic premise that shapes everything else from like gameplay to the narrative is the idea that for a lot of these games, right, you, you are, sorry, you're dishing out damage while trying to avoid taking it, right? Like there's that basic premise, right? And then that can expand, and depending on the game, depending on the genre, that can be delivered in a variety of ways, right? But that's the basic idea. And it's something that's inherently mathematical, right? Because you're either trying to ideally be at 100% and stay at 100% while, decimating your opponents. Or realistically, you're trying to not get down to 0%, right? Um, and if you're taking damage, you're trying to recover from it or minimize said damage, right? Like, so that's the idea. And then there can be all sorts of twists on that, depending again on the game and the genre, and it can get wild. At its core, again, it's something that's inherently mathematical, but it can come to you in so many different ways. Whether we're talking about the way your health is represented, the way damage is represented, to like the system, the underlining combat systems in any given game. And so I look forward to talking about that all. So when it comes to beat 'em ups, if we start there to like frame the rest of this conversation, you have the idea of what I was just talking about before, that you're trying to dish out damage or trying to avoid taking it. And here, it's not just like a one-on-one thing typically. You're fighting waves, right? You're fighting waves of opponents. And we go back to the earlier like 2D side-scrolling games. The idea is for a lot of those games, you're moving around that screen, fighting different opponents. Sometimes it was like pretty straightforward. Sometimes you could go up and down as you do it. But the idea is that you're going along the screen, and you're trying to hit your opponents and you're trying to evade them. Sometimes you could jump and things like that, but no matter how you cut it, it's mathematical, and you're doing this dance with your opponents, right? And you're dealing with multiple opponents as you go forward. And so as you're taking down this opponent and that opponent, and you're going through wave after wave, you typically will reach a boss, right? And they're tougher. Maybe they fight dirty, or maybe they're just like crazy strong. But whatever the case may be, right, they're operating differently, and how they operate is again something that's mathematical, because you have that basic premise of dishing out damage and trying to avoid taking it. But the way your opponents are moving, the amount of damage that they can inflict, and the way that they can inflict it, they're inherently mathematical as well. And so you're just doing this dance, and you're seeing like this visual representation of all these different calculations going on, and you're progressing through the story, if there's a story in that game, or you're progressing through the level at a minimum, and you're in your characters choose, and you might have like a single character that you're going throughout that level or throughout the levels with, but you typically have multiple characters in those old school 2D side scroller games, like and sometimes you can do co-op, and whatever the case may be, you're going through your levels, and you're maintaining your health, you're doing combos. Sometimes you're picking up weapons and power ups, and sometimes like health, and occasionally weapons, right? The idea is typically, you're dealing with your hands and your feet, like your fists and your feet. Um, but an extension of that is the hack and slash genre. And here's the thing about that, right? Like it didn't just start in the 3D realm. You had hack and slash games back in the day, and we'll get into that in a second. But for some of the like the 2D side scrollers, right? It's like there's so many of them. But I know like a big one, at least like back in my time, was like the Double Dragon series. So you had like Double Dragon, but you also had things like Streets of Rage, Final Fight. You had some different like franchises that got into the mix, right? Like you had some of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle games, some of the Power Ranger ones. You had Spider-Man and Venom, Maximum Carnage, which is a crazy game and has a really cool theme. But then they all had like their own twist on what I just said, but it boils down to the same thing. And it's just cool though to see like a basic premise be expanded upon, right? And being able to like, be handled by like different teams and different companies to like provide a different experience despite that basic premise. And at any rate, when we get into hack and slash games again, like there were 2D hack and slash games before, notably some of the older Ninja Gaiden games, like the 2D Ninja Gaiden games, and like Golden Axe, like for instance, right? They fall into that where it's like, hey, they're beat 'em ups, but they're beat 'em ups with like weapons, right? And you get into the hack and slash, and you kind of go from there, right? Um, but that's the big idea, right? You had different characters with different weapons, and doing different combos and stuff like that. So it's you know that same thing, that idea of the beat 'em up, but expanded. So you're not just using your fists, you're not just doing your feet, you're not just collecting weapons along the way. Although you might be doing those things, but you have more weapons to deal with, right? More things to do, and occasionally, like, maybe you'll get some sort of projectile weapons that you can use along the way. And then, as time progressed and these ideas expanded, we get like developments in tech. But we get something quite crazy that I am proud and glad to say that I was able to experience, and that's this: the jump from 2D to 3D. Now you still will get some 2D, like beat 'em up and hack and slash games, right? But things change when we went to like 3D. And like real quick before we go down that rabbit hole, like for some of the 2D beat 'em up games that you still like get out there, beat 'em up and hack and slash games, like three come to mind. That I've played in recent years that have been decent. Like you have Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge. It's got all of that like crazy feel like of those older games, but like way more polished. And just like a blast to play. You have like Power Rangers Battle on the Grid. Uh Battle for the Grid. I'm messing up my preposition there. Um but anyway, I think it's like Battle for the Grid. But either way, it's fun. And the third one that's coming to mind is a King's Tale, like Final Fantasy 15, because that's one that I don't think too many people knew about, and it is dope. Um, so my whole thing though is just that like that genre didn't die. 2D games in general didn't die, and they can be an absolute blast still, and they're benefiting from years of progress. And it's a wonderful, beautiful thing. But let's switch gears and go to 3D. Okay, so here's the thing, right? Like, and again, it's something that I've been lucky enough to have experienced in my lifetime. And for those tuning in who are unaware, I was born in '87, right? Like 1987, August 7th, 1987. And so, like, at the time of this recording, I'll be 38 soon. Like, I'm pushing 40. So it's like, I'm not as young as I may look, if you were curious. So for me, I was old enough to remember a time where, 2D games reigned supreme, and then you started seeing like some of those games experiment with 3D. And then you got to the point where you started to get like a more true like 3D, and it was like a crazy thing because one minute you're just playing like these 2D games and you see some cool, interesting stuff here and there, but then bam, you see things like Tekken, and it's like what? And it's really cool. At the time, you're just like, oh, okay, these new games are coming out, right? And things have changed, but you don't have like the context, or at least like for me, I didn't have the context. Like I first saw a PlayStation game when I was 8, like back in the day when it came out, like around that era. And so for me, it was like brand new and it was cool and all, but like I didn't have the proper context. You know what I mean? Like I did and I didn't. And the more I learned and the more I thought about it over time, it's just like it's a crazy thing because like we didn't have it and then we did, and it's just like a lot of things like were like that where it's just like yes, things are gonna develop over time, but it's just like going from 2D to 3D is a jump, and I'm glad that we get like 2D and 3D games still, and sometimes the blending of those perspectives. But yeah, so if we get back to like hack and slash games, right? Like it's a wild thing, and we gotta talk about Devil May Cry just to kick things off. So one of the biggest, if not the biggest game that had an impact on like the hack and slash games of that era and going forward, um, if we're looking at like 3D hack and slash games, the biggest influence, like, it's gotta be Devil May Cry, right? Like, and it's just a wild thing because it's like, one, it had a crazy like development history, right? Like, it started off as the Resident Evil 4 game, right? Like, when it was in development before it was decided that hey, this is like way too different from a Resident Evil game, and it should be its own IP instead. Um, so yeah, it's just a wild thing because so we don't get Devil May Cry without Resident Evil and that whole series, but we also don't get it without all of the work that was done on those like T like sorry 2D hack and slash games, and I'm sure like some 3D ones that must have been around that era because there were some, right? Like but you have this idea of a lot of those arcade games being influences for Devil May Cry in its particular style, but it took what worked, I think, about a lot of those hack and slashes and beat 'em ups, and it expanded that, right? Like, so it's a really cool game because the idea is like all those games before it, it's you're dishing out damage while trying to avoid taking it, and so it's like, well, how does that shape up in Devil May Cry? And I've talked about this in several videos, but the idea is like it's very combo heavy to start, right? Like, so you're doing different combos, you're dealing with different melee weapons that have in some cases different elemental attributes, and you also have that ability to evade. And I'm thinking just like that first Devil May Cry because then things expanded over time. But so you have those basic ideas, right? Like, so you're dishing out damage while trying to avoid taking it. You have a rich combo system, and you could also evade. You could buy items. Using orbs that you gain throughout the game, like either through finding them or defeating enemies, and so you're like very like engrossed in that idea of exploring those levels. So it's like you're not side scrolling anymore, but you're navigating that 3D environment. You're still going from location to location, and you're doing it with a bunch of combos, looking cool, and it's all stylistic math action at the end of the day. And so I think that's really cool. And it brought a lot to that idea, right? Like, so it's really cool. Like, Devil May Cry, it impacted so much, and of course, you wouldn't get later Devil May Cry games without that first Devil May Cry. But you also don't get games like God of War. You don't get games like the 3D Ninja Gaiden games. Just to be clear, you get the 2D ones, and so you were realistically probably going to get some 3D ones eventually. And I think maybe before some of the ones that we saw, but maybe not. I don't know. I would have to check up again. But my point is, Ninja Gaiden definitely benefited from Devil May Cry being around, and the same can be said for, like I said, God of War, but also things like later on, Metal Gear Rising, as well as Nier Automata, which is my favorite game of all time, and Bayonetta, and honestly, like Platinum Games in general, which was involved. Sorry, like who were involved with Rising, with Automata, and through collaborations, but then developed Bayonetta in that series on their own among other games. And the creator of Devil May Cry is or was the CEO of Platinum Games. Either way, that was his whole thing, um, and that explains a lot. But yeah, so you had like those games that some might call like character action games, but it's just like they're hack and slash games to me. Both work, right? But I'm just not used to that one. Although I've heard it a number of times over the years. So you had games like Devil May Cry and some of the games that I mentioned that followed that. But then you also had games like Dynasty Warriors, right? And also Drakengard. And Drakengard was particularly cool because you had that like sort of Dynasty Warriors sort of combat, or reminiscent of that. But you also had dragons, and of course, you don't get near Automata without, like I said, that influence that Devil May Cry had without Platinum Games and that influence. But you also, of course, don't get it without its predecessor, Near Replicant, and you don't get Near Replicant without Drakengard. So it's like because Near Automata is a sequel to Near Replicant, which is a spin-off from an alternate ending of Drakengard. But yeah, so my whole thing is like you have different ways to do these hack and slash games, um, but the idea is they're an evolution of what came before them, an extension of that. And then when you look at the action RPG games, where like Near Automata, for instance, falls under that category, as does Near Replicant or Near Gestalt or Near, depending on your experience with that game. But the idea is like these games, uh, not only do they feature those like hack and slash elements that we talked about before, but a lot of RPG elements that you've come to expect over time. And if we focus on Near Automata, because it's just like the pinnacle of all that to me, we can see some cool stuff with that because you have that idea of like, yes, you're dishing out damage while trying to avoid taking it. You're typically fighting off hordes, like right, you're fighting off waves of opponents, and as you're going forward, you're doing these different combos, you're getting different weapons, and you're experimenting and switching things up on the fly, which without Devil May Cry 3, I don't think that's as prevalent as it has become. But anyway, right, like with Nier Automata, you have like these options, sure, right, and they're a big part of the game and they're a beautiful part of the game, but you also have the RPG elements that you've come to expect, right, over the years. You have that idea that you are gaining experience points, that you're leveling up, that you have a lot of customization, and in the form of like Nier Automata, like not only are you able to customize your weapons and what you have at any given moment, you have the idea of the chip system, and that chip system is like kind of taking the place of like gear and equipment. And so you have your melee attacks, and then you have the idea of like your long range attacks too. So you're able to do all this stuff. And going back to the beginning with beat 'em up games, it's like so without those beat 'em up games, without hack and slash games extending from that, and without like that fusion of hack and slash and RPGs, we don't get like my favorite game of all time. But I mentioned all of it just to say that like you have all these games influencing each other and all this evolution happening over time, and I think it's really cool because I like beat 'em up games. I like the extension of that in the forms of like hack and slash games, and I like some action RPGs because, and for the record, an action RPG does not necessarily have to be a hack and slash game, right? Like the idea is largely that it's an RPG with real time combat, but like the hack and slash typically comes with that, and Nier Automata just it blends those two things together and like more because it's like you have that hack and slash stuff too, but there's also like shooter elements too, so it's like it's really cool. Um, but yeah, so I bring up all that to say like, hey, beat up games, hack and slash games, action RPGs. These are some of my favorite genres, and they're all linked. And I just like I like so many genres in general, just gaming in general, and it's math and action. And I dig it because like math is everywhere and everything. And I feel like with gaming, you have this unique opportunity to not only see math and art, fused together in this vibrant way, but you also have this like very interactive, immersive opportunity to practice and build empathy. And with these action titles and games related to them, right? Combat is at their core, and there's so many different ways to take the basic idea of dishing out damage while trying to avoid taking it. There's so many ways that you can display that. Um, and so many ways you can tie that to the narrative and exploring, right? Because like at the end of the day, whatever the combat system is, right? um, you're using it, you're navigating that world, you're navigating that narrative. And so the fact that you can have so many different spins on that is really cool to me. Because again, it's math and it's art in such a visceral, immersive way. Right? It hits you hard. Like I dig gaming, I dig math, I dig art, and I dig some action games. I'll see you all in the future. Professor Prime out.